The story I'm about to tell you today is a tribute to a collector called Lindsay Mears. He passed away about 3 months ago. It was very good of Lindsay to actually ring me up and say that he was suffering from cancer. He only had 3 months to live. He knew I collected Boer War rifles, and I'd once before bought one from him actually, a ZAR Martini. But as I said, he rang me up and said, Dave, I've only got 3 months. I have another Boer War rifle. It's a Lee-Enfield Mark I Star, which I'm holding now. And I would very much like you to add that to your collection. So it was very good of him to actually offer it to me, and I was very pleased to buy it from Lindsay. So Lindsay, RIP, a jolly good fellow. To date, I've mainly spoken about rifles that were used by Boers, mainly Mauser rifles. That's the M1895, Boer Mauser and 7x57mm. But today I'm going to have a change of pace. I'm going to talk about rifles used by the colonials. And when I say colonials, we're talking about Canadians, New Zealanders, Australians and South African, English-speaking South Africans in the colonies of Natal and the Cape Colony. Unlike the British soldiers who went to war with the magazine Lee Metford and magazine Lee-Enfield rifles, most of the colonials, not all, but most of the colonials were still armed with the single-shot Martini-Metford and Martini-Enfield rifles and carbines. Certainly in South Africa, the majority of the militia forces and the regiment and the regular forces, volunteer forces in South Africa, were still armed with Martini-Enfield rifles. In 1895, the colony of Natal had imported Martini-Metford rifles, and only shortly before the outbreak of war in October 1899 did they change and re-equip with Martini-Enfields. So we're talking about the same year that the Boer War broke out. The colony was still buying obsolete Martini-Enfield rifles. And certainly some of the units went to war, went into action using these. I'm talking about the Imperial Light Horse, Thornycroft's Mounted Infantry, and such like, Natal Carbineers, Natal Mounted Rifles. Now in New Zealand and Australia it was a very similar situation. New Zealand didn't have any magazine rifles. So the first contingent of Australians and New Zealanders who went over in 1899 were carrying Martini-Enfield rifles and all Martini-Enfield carbines, a mixture of both. The Kiwis had Martini-Enfield artillery carbines. A lot of them got off at the port of Beira in Portuguese East Africa, travelled through to Rhodesia, and when they got to Rhodesia they were re-equipped with the likes of Lee Speed and Lee Metford rifles. In those days, Australia was a collection of colonies. There was the colony of Victoria, the colony of Queensland, colony of New South Wales, and each contingent that went over were from the various states. The same scenario happened with the Australians. Nearly all of them went over with Martini-Enfield rifles and or carbines, depending on if they were cavalry or mounted infantry, etc. The majority of them were, of the early contingents, were re-equipped with the Lee Metfords and Lee-Enfields when they got to Cape Town. So there we have it. You know, in the Boer War there were colonials who were still equipped with the single-shot Martini-Enfield, Martini-Metford rifles and carbines, some of which I've got here today to show you. Now, the rifle in question, as I mentioned before, that I got from Lindsay Mears, is a Lee-Enfield Mark I Star. The interesting thing is, and of course the reason I wanted it was, it's got his name very neatly carved onto the stock, and the name is G.H. Vickery. His name was George Henry Vickery. He came from South Australia in Australia. That's a colony of South Australia. And he joined up with the New South Wales Mounted Rifles, in fact the second New South Wales Mounted Rifles. He joined up in 1901, so the Boer War had already been going for a couple of years. He left Australia, left Sydney in March 1901, and arrived in Cape Town, made their way up to the Transvaal. At that stage, 1901, towards the end of 1901, things had changed. It was the guerrilla war was in full swing. They did a lot of campaigning through western Transvaal. One of their notable things was they captured a large convoy of Boer wagons, 105 or 106 wagons in total, with a lot of ammunition. And they went on to capture another wagon some months later and about 1,000 prisoners. So they were there at the tail end of the war. The thing that I found really interesting, in addition to his surname, which is carved here, is on this side of the butt he's also got 2 MR for second mounted rifles. and that's 2nd New South Wales mounted rifles. Now, a friend of mine also has the same model, a Lee-Enfield Mark I Star, to a gentleman called Farrell. Now, Mr. Farrell is in my 2nd book, my Carvings from the Veldt Part 2, and Farrell's rifle is exactly the same. It's been stamped 2MR. This is number 902. This is Vickery's rifle, 902, and Farrell was 929. So there were only 27 numbers different between the two. So the two men probably both knew each other. But interesting to know that there's the 2nd Regiment of New South Wales Mounted Rifles. It would appear that all of the rifles in that particular unit were numbered. What Vickery's gone on to do as well, he's got the name Kruger on this side of the butt, and there are 2 busts that have been carved on either side of the wrist. One is Paul Kruger with his big beard, which you cannot miss the effigy of Paul Kruger, and on the other side is Queen Victoria. So we've got Queen Victoria, we've got Paul Kruger, we've got the name Kruger here, and as I said, 2MR for 2nd Mounted Rifles, and he's number 902. Interestingly enough, he obviously didn't finish the carving because there's a small carving on this side of the butt, and on close inspection what it is, or what it was going to be, was the ZAR coat of arms. You can just see the eagle surmounted at the top of the badge of the ZAR, but he stopped there. For what reason, I don't know. I tend to think there was going to be more inscriptions on this butt, but maybe the troopship had arrived back home in Sydney and he'd run out of time. But certainly he was allowed to keep his service rifle, which wasn't always the case. A lot of the New Zealanders were actually allowed to keep their rifles when they came home. They think possibly New Zealand collectors, the likes of Len King, believe there were in the region of about 4,500 rifles were probably kept and taken home by servicemen who were returning from the war in South Africa. I think, like most of the Australian and New Zealand contingents, George Vickery had completed his tour of service after 12 months. They boarded ship, this is the 2nd New South Wales Mounted Rifles, in May 1902, and by the time they got back to Sydney, the war was over. Peace had been declared on the 31st of May 1902, so that was it. Shortly thereafter, the unit was disbanded and the boys were sent home, demobbed. Well, it took a few years later and along came World War I. Well, our friend Mr. Vickery must have enjoyed life in uniform, because he goes and joins up again. So 1916, George Vickery goes along to the recruiting office and joins the 44th Battalion AIF, which is Australian Imperial Force. He's sent over to France. They did basic training. I beg your pardon, he was sent over to the UK and did basic training in the UK, and then was sent over to France to join the trenches with all the other poor devils who were over there. Along comes March 1917 and he's wounded in action. There's a comment in his papers to say that he was wounded in action but remained on duty. That was March 1917. A few months later, gets to October 1917, he's badly wounded again, the 2nd time, this time wounded in action in the cheek. So it doesn't state whether it was a gunshot wound or a shell wound, possibly the latter. But obviously, being a facial wound, it was quite severe. He was sent back to Casualty Clearing Station and then back to the UK. After his stint in hospital, he was sent back home to Australia and demobbed in 1918, about mid-1918, no longer fit for service overseas. One of the things which was very interesting and is so good for all you collectors out there is when I managed to get this rifle, as I mentioned, from Lindsay Mears, it came with a photograph of George Vickery. So there's a photograph of George Vickery in his Boer War uniform, which we'll show you. And to me, that's the cherry on top of the cake. If you can actually get a rifle named to this particular man and you can get a photograph of him, that really is the be-all and end-all of collecting in my book. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the story. Thank you.